Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring some of the successes in applied parapsychology that emerged from the remote viewing research program at SRI International. With me is Russell Targ, the co-founder of that program. Russell is a laser physicist and is also the author of many books on parapsychology, including most recently The Reality of ESP, a physicist's proof of psychic ability. Some of his other titles include Mind at Large, Mind Reach, The Mind Race, The Heart of the Mind, and Limitless Mind. Welcome, Russell.
Happy to be with you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, it's so funny to me that people are debating, even parapsychologists, does ESP really exist? And here in your career, you have seen over and over and over again that it exists, that it can be highly accurate at times, and that it has very real practical consequences when it is put to use in an applied situation. And frankly, that's why the U.S. government funded that remote viewing research program year after year for 2 decades.
You're right. Parapsychologists are as skeptical as anyone. More than once when I've been lecturing at the Parapsychological Association meeting, talking about some of the work we did at SRI, some very successful experiments or something like that, I would say, of all you researchers, who is absolutely convinced that something like ESP is real? And I might get 2 hands. Stephen Schwartz might put up his hand, Ed May might put up his hand, and all the other hundreds of people say, well, there may be some error, can't tell, looks like it's ESP, but there's really a very small handful of people, after decades of work, are still willing to stand up and say, lasers exist, streetcars exist, ESP exists.
I think some of them are honestly afraid they'll get fired from their job if they come out too strongly.
It was definitely about fear.
And in fact, as I recall, at one point you learned that the CIA felt that you were too much of an enthusiast.
That's right. They could trust Hal Puthoff to be a company man, but they couldn't trust me because I was enthusiastic about the reality of the phenomena that they had given us $20 million to investigate.
Well, let's talk about some of the reasons for your enthusiasm.
And we could talk about how this program at SRI went on for 23 years at a rate of about $20 million to support the program. So CIA evidently thought we were doing something worthwhile.
But we're talking maybe about $1 million a year, which is peanuts for the CIA.
But it's peanuts for the CIA, quite a bit of money for a ESP program.
Absolutely. Probably the most significant funding for ESP research in the history of the world.
If you look in the newspapers, you don't see anything about ESP anymore. Psychic abilities were real when there was a well-funded program at SRI. When there was money on the table, then ESP was real. When the money dried up, people weren't sure anymore.
Well, and for all we know, there is money going into programs that are simply not disclosed at all to the public. And given all the controversy surrounding the field, maybe that's wise, because on top of the irrational skeptics, you often have people who believe for religious reasons that this is real enough, but with the work of the devil.
That's right. If you're interested in ESP, the easiest way to pursue it would be in the basement of the CIA. Why else would they cancel a program that was working so well?
Well, of course, people will ponder that question for a long time, and I've heard many different answers, but let's share some of the real success stories.
An early example during the Iran hostage crisis, which would be in the early 70s, we had all of the hostages from the Iranian embassy had been captured by the dissident students, so-called, and we were visited by Jake Stewart, who's a naval captain for the Office of Naval Research, and he said, "I've got a picture here in an envelope. Don't open the envelope." And he didn't tell us it was an Iranian hostage. In fact, I had no idea it was an Iranian hostage. He said, "Can you tell us about this person?" And I went into our little shielded workroom with a psychic of the day, a person we were working with. And I said, "I've got a picture here from Jake Stewart. No idea who it is. It could be Khrushchev, could be the president, could be anybody. He said, tell me about this person." And the psychic held it and rubbed his hands over the picture and said, "This person is very sick. This is a man who's in a dark place, both physically and mentally. He's quite sick. He seems to be shaking, but I see him getting out of that place. That even though he's pretty sick, I see him coming out of this darkness into the light, and is getting on an airplane." So that's what I got. The basic idea is we've got a picture of a pretty sick person who's headed for being on an airplane. So I gave that to Jake Stewart, and he gave us no feedback. He said, "Well, I'll see how you did."
You often did not get feedback.
That's right.
Working with the government agencies.
So within a week, we learned that it was Ambassador Queen, who was the deputy American ambassador to Iran.
Richard
Queen, who had developed multiple sclerosis when he was in captivity. After a year in captivity, he got very sick, and the Iranians agreed to release him. They didn't want an American to die in captivity. So they released him, and he was flown to Germany for medical care. So everything that the psychic had to say was correct, with no input at all. Just tell me about the person in the envelope. And that was evidence of the kind of things that mediums often do in so-called cold readings. We just say, "Tell me about this person," and the person will often be deceased. But in this case, the psychic was able to give quite a good rendition of the health and the circumstances of this person.
And you didn't get feedback, I presume, so you don't know whether that reading was at all instrumental in facilitating the reading.
No, I think it was not instrumental. I think that at the time that we were doing the reading, the Americans were working with the Iranians to get Queen out of the cell that he was in. I think that's true. I don't know that that's true.
Yeah. Okay.
But certainly the description was appropriate for the contemporaneous situation.
So, I mean, when you're dealing in an area like military intelligence, you've got the issue of accuracy or inaccuracy, but you also have the issue of actionability, whether even if it's accurate, the information can be useful.
In fact, this may have been a test for us because the fellow was in was a dynamic situation. He wasn't somebody who'd been in jail for 50 years. It's somebody who was sick and they hoped to get him out. So there was some action associated with the whole task.
Well, there are many other examples I know that involved highly accurate and important information that was retrieved through remote viewing.
The deal we made with the CIA is we would spend half of our time doing research trying to understand how psychic abilities and remote viewing operated.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're physicists. We wanted to know, does ESP become degraded with electric shielding? And it did not. And how is it affected by distance or by looking into the future? And we found that the most important findings we discovered is the non-local nature of the ability,
mm-hmm.
that the accuracy and reliability was independent of distance and independent of time up to a few days or weeks into the future.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like a so-called non-local phenomenon, independent of time and space.
Yeah.
One of the operational targets we had from the CIA was 1974, when our contract monitor, Ken Kress, came to us and just gave me a slip of paper and said, we want to know what's at this place, what's going on. I, of course, had no idea at all. It could be any place on the planet. It could be the inside of the Pentagon. It could be anything.
Was it a coordinate or a number?
It was geographical coordinates.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I went with Pat Price, who was the man we were working with at the time, the retired police commissioner from the city of Burbank, who said that he had done psychic stuff like this all of his life. As a police commissioner, he would hear of a crime committed and send the squad car to where he saw a frightened man in the city of Burbank,
mm-hmm.
and they would just arrest the perpetrator on the spot. And he came to us with his whole scrapbook showing his psychic exploits as a police commissioner.
Mm-hmm.
So Price and I went into our little shielded phone booth where we did our work,
mm-hmm.
and sat down at a table, and Price began to draw, and he drew a complex sort of an R&D facility, and said, there's a giant gantry crane here. So the first thing that he wrote down was the word gantry. Mm-hmm. No feedback. That was his first thing. He said, there's this very big gantry crane rolling back and forth over a building.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to have to draw that.
Mm-hmm.
So by and by, he made a drawing of what appeared to be a very big gantry crane, because he drew a little man coming up to the wheel.
Mm.
And this was a A-shaped gantry frame rolling over a building.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I'm lying in the sun, like sun feels good, and as I'm lying on this building, a giant gantry crane is rolling back and forth over my body.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to draw this A-shaped gantry crane.
Mm-hmm.
So we delivered that picture to the motel where Ken Kress was staying with his partner, and they looked at that picture and they looked at one another, and then out of his suitcase he took a secret document in a rolled up secret carrying case and unrolled this drawing of a photograph. They didn't want us to see the photographic secret
mm-hmm.
drawing, because that would reveal the resolution of the cameras. So, but they had an artist rendition of the actual photograph, and in the middle of that drawing there was this giant gantry crane, indeed, with 8 wheels, 4 on either side of the building, rolling on tracks.
Mm-hmm.
Surprisingly, even for us, we were 2 years into the program and saw a lot of good-looking remote viewing.
And this was during the Cold War era. We're talking about a target site that turned out to be in the Soviet Union.
Indeed, this is Soviet Siberia.
Uh-huh.
And there, in a certain sense, there's no way to cheat. I was with Price in the shielded room. The contract monitors were testing us, and we had no idea. Price would have had no opportunity to go anywhere to find out what the target was. It's not mm-hmm. like he could find his friends who could break into the CIA vault and find out what was at those coordinates. The coordinates wouldn't show you anything because satellite photography was only just beginning to be developed. There was no pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, well, that's remarkable. Can you tell us what's going on in that building?
Mm-hmm.
The crane is going back and forth over the building.
Yeah.
And Price and I went back into our shielded room, and he said, they're building something out of steel gores. I see men in white coats. They had a gore is like an orange peel slice
Mm-hmm.
of something. And he said, let me draw that. This is like a 60-foot diameter sphere that they're making. And he drew a shell-shaped gore, like an orange peel slice. That's
Right.
really what it looked like.
Mm-hmm.
60 feet in diameter. And he said, there's very thick steel. They're having trouble welding it together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I show. They're making this giant steel sphere. And we took that back to Ken Kress and said, this is what's going on. He said, well, that's very interesting. I don't know what's actually going on there.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, Price died before we ever got feedback. 2 years went by until they rolled these big spheres out of the building, and satellite photography showed them, and Aviation Week published pictures of the 60-foot steel spheres and like 58-foot steel spheres, and mentioned they were having trouble welding them because the steel was so thick.
Mm-hmm.
So Price described something that was utterly unknown to the CIA at the time. As a result, we didn't even get credit for this remarkable remote viewing because no one knew about it until 2 years later.
Yeah.
But eventually, that was one of the principal things that went into Ken Kress's detailed write-up of psychic research during the Cold War.
So, the CIA wisely regarded this simply as another form of intelligence input.
That's right. And they don't trust one. You needed more than one asset to give you the information.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, they did. Well, they knew that the crane was correct because they had a photograph of the crane from satellite photography strongly matching what Price had done, but they had no corroboration for the gores making up the steel sphere. Mm-hmm. What Price was looking at, the steel spheres did not exist at the time of Price's drawing them. Just as he said, they were building steel spheres out of these gores,
mm-hmm.
and it took 2 years to finish the steel sphere and roll them out.
Yeah. Was he able to talk about the purpose?
He thought that it was a containment vessel for a nuclear weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And we were later told that it was a containment vessel for a particle beam weapon. And even today, different people have different ideas what they're used for. And I think that the Soviets built big steel spheres for a number of purposes. So I can't tell you exactly. That I've heard authoritatively both of those two entirely different answers from different people.
Yeah. Well,
But the spheres were described correctly, and they are made of gores. Price was the first person in my life, outside of a dress store, I'd never heard the word gore. The woman's flared dress would be a four gore skirt. My mother brought me up to know what that was. But until Price said the word 40 years later, I'd never heard the word.
Well, now our viewers now know.
That's right.
I think one of the most impressive instances had to do with the discovery. I think Joe McMoneagle was the remote viewer of a new class of submarine that was completely unknown to the U.S. government at the time.
That's right. Skip Atwater, who was the director of the Fort Meade remote viewing program. I interviewed 6 Army intelligence people, and they were the basis for creating a psychic Army Corps at Fort Meade. And one of the principal remote viewers was Joe McMoneagle. And one day, Skip Atwater came to Joe and a contract monitor and a interviewer and said, "Can you two guys figure out what the Russians are doing in this giant building here?"
Mm-hmm.
Big building, quarter mile from the Baltic in the Soviet Union. And Joe said, "I see them welding, a lot of welding going on. They're making a submarine." And Joe was a intelligence officer, so he would recognize a submarine if he saw one. And he said, "This is the biggest submarine I've ever seen. In fact, this is more than 50% bigger than any submarine I've ever seen."
Mm-hmm.
In reality, it turned out to be twice as big as any submarine he had ever seen. And he said with his hands in the interview that it's like two hulls welded together, and has all sorts of new capabilities, including forward-firing missile tubes, which is to say they could fire nuclear weapons while they were underway.
Mm-hmm.
And he drew pictures of the sub, and he said, "I think this is going to be released 120 days from now." It was actually released 114 days. And that was the first anyone on the American side knew anything about the supergiant submarine, the Typhoon class sub.
Mm-hmm.
So you can now look on the internet and see Typhoon class submarines, and then extra wide, extra large, looking surprisingly like a whale floating in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And Joe described that with no input at all except the coordinates of a building, and that building was a quarter mile from the ocean, so it even didn't seem likely that they would build a giant submarine in this building. And it turned out they had to then get bulldozers and backhoes and cut a channel from the building to the sea to release the sub.
That's quite interesting.
And we have Joe's drawings of that, contemporaneous drawings.
Mm-hmm. Well, that would seem to be a really significant breakthrough. That would be almost a perfect example, I should think, of the sort of thing that the CIA would be very, very pleased to get.
Yes. The director of the CIA, who was Robert Gates at the time, said that's a remarkable drawing. It was really your lucky day today. That was CIA's.
Well, there was another instance that Jimmy Carter was informed about, and I think later wrote about.
Yeah, Carter, in fact, gave us credit for that.
Mm-hmm.
Our contract monitor at the time was Dale Graff, who was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, supporting our work and doing remote viewing with viewers there.
Mm-hmm.
And a Russian plane was lost in northern Africa. Turned out what happened is a Russian aviator wanted to defect, so he was flying over Zaire, and he ejected with his parachute and landed, and the plane kept going for hundreds of miles. So satellite photography and ground searches failed to find the airplane. As Gail says in our movie, they didn't find the airplane because they were looking in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about your documentary, Third Eye Spy.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And Gail went to one of his very successful remote viewers at Wright-Patterson, and she marked a map and put a circle on it and said, "You're going to find this plane here." And he came to SRI and interviewed one of the remote viewers that I had worked with, and the fellow drew a picture of a river and showed the tail of the plane sticking up, and said the mountains are beyond this to the east, and the village to the west of the river, and you're going to find the plane between the river and the village. And Gail handed in all this information, and the CIA then took a helicopter to the circle that the woman had drawn, and in fact, as they landed the airplane, they saw natives with pieces of airplane crossing the path where the helicopter landed. And even though it couldn't be seen with satellite photography, Gail's team of remote viewers found the helicopter.
Now you said Gale, you mean Dale.
Dale Graff.
Dale Graff, yeah.
Found the helicopter just where his people said that it would be.
Mm-hmm.
And Jimmy Carter was the one who was president at the time, eager to get this airplane. It was a Russian bomber on reconnaissance duty, so it was full of code books and cameras and reconnaissance apparatus. So President Carter was eager to find the airplane, and he was described. He later was associated with his college in Georgia, and he was lecturing each year. He would answer questions, and someone asked him, "What is the most amazing thing you ever saw when you were president?" And he then narrated this story. He said, a clairvoyant woman, I think you'd call her, found a downed airplane that couldn't be seen by satellite photography, and we actually sent in a helicopter and pulled it out, and then that was part of a ESP program we had in California, and that actually blew our cover for the program and contributed toward the ending of our program. And Jimmy Carter then included a little narrative of that in his most recent autobiography. So he has a chapter called Clairvoyance, where he describes exactly the satellite photography could not find the airplane, but the psychics in California could find it.
Well, this is an example of actionable information that was acted upon and achieved a result. One would think at that point there would no longer be any further controversy.
Right. That's a case where we did get credit for a remarkable remote viewing, and the result of getting credit for the remarkable program was the end of the program.
Russell Targ, it's ironic that we should close on such a note. Obviously, people who would like to see parapsychology pursued more have a lot of work to do yet.
That's right.
But we can all feel very proud of what has been accomplished up until now, and particularly by yourself and your colleagues in that program. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us.